Good morning, everybody. This is day 5 of our Public Health Applications Biodiversity Informatics course. We've got a very open format today. Unfortunately, none of you sent me any suggestions, so amongst the instructors we came up with some suggestions. And I'll show you a list of topics that we are envisioning for today. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about looking to the future. And so we'll start off talking about constraints, essentially what is limiting progress in this field. Then we'll, in a second session, we'll talk a bit about the future again, but what are the opportunities? And what sorts of things can happen that can really open ways forward. In the third piece of the morning, we will come back to the idea of public health and biodiversity. And then at the end, if you all send us some questions, we'll answer what we've heard. Again, use biodivtraining@gmail.com. Send us questions, because the whole idea of this is to interact with you all. This course has been great in terms of interacting amongst the instructors. So we're having fun regardless, but we'd love you to join in the discussions. So that's essentially what we're going to try to do today. The people you have with you are Abdallah, Luis, me, there's Kate, and we're hoping Lindsay will show up at some point. So, in fact, there's Lindsay. But essentially what we'd like to do is keep this very open and kind of roundtable in format. So we're not going to do much in the way of organized presentations or anything like that. I've got some things to show you about these topics, and hopefully that will be enough to stimulate conversation and discussion amongst the instructors, and hopefully it'll also be enough to get you guys participating as well. So again, send us questions as they come to mind. So just to start off with a fairly simple point, I wanted to talk with you a bit about how disease-relevant data are selected and how they are recorded. So let's share this screen with you all. And give me 1 second. There we go. So this is a very interesting paper that came out a few years ago by Lars and Rebecca Eisen. And essentially what the title is all about is that spatial epidemiological data for vector-borne diseases is not being collected appropriately. And this is in Emerging Infectious Diseases. It's an open access journal, so you can check it out pretty easily. What I want to do is just show you a couple figures from this paper. This figure, to me, was huh? Hello? Okay, I'm not sure what that is. But take a look at this figure. And this is essentially, it's a comparison of spatial distributions of areas of California with different incidences of Lyme disease, 1993 to 2005, based on counties as a spatial aggregation unit versus zip code districts as spatial units. So this is very interesting because right away you see that a lot of these southern areas, essentially south of central California, a lot of those southern areas are not appreciated at all in the coarse county-based view. You can only appreciate them as as you go to a finer spatial unit for aggregation of data. I found that to be a very interesting point. And essentially what the Eisens were suggesting was that the usual way of representing disease occurrence data in the US is by reporting county level occurrences. In other countries, it is generally parallel, which is to say things are reported to districts or municipalities or something like that. But the other thing that the Eisens provided was this. And this is just a map of the United States with counties shown. And what you need to notice on this is that in the east, counties are small. And in the west, counties get very, very large. In fact, if you compare some of the states in the east, there are states in the east that are smaller than counties in the west. And so another point about using counties as a reference area is that you have an east-west gradient in the precision of those references, because the precision gets higher in the east and lower in the west. So this is a big problem, particularly for using this sort of mapping approaches. I felt pretty strongly about this issue, and so I responded to this paper. Here we are. Get you guys a view of my response, and then basically I just want you to see one figure in this response. This is spatial patterns east to west in counties, and in the middle in zip codes, which was the recommendation of the Eisens, and they also mentioned the possibility of census tracts. And what I want you to notice is that in all three cases, you have larger units in the west of the US and smaller units in the east of the US. And there's a very simple reason behind that. Population density in the western United States is lower than population density in the eastern United States. And I know these are US examples, but those same things could be said about almost any of the countries that are represented in this course, which is to say, for example, Lindsay spoke about Benin. And if I'm not mistaken, Benin has much higher population density in the south along the coast than in the north at the edge of the desert. So these are very general points. And essentially what it brings us back to is, very generally, how do we record and report disease data? I believe this is one of the biggest and most serious constraints on forward progress in mapping disease transmission risk. That is, as long as we're referencing occurrences to polygons, we constrain the set of methodologies that we can use. And a very interesting transition would be to move our disease recording to points and associated uncertainties. And then for reporting, notice that I said recording for points and uncertainties. For reporting, we can always report at the level of counties or of zip codes or of whatever as a way of avoiding any problems with privacy concerns. So I think there's an easy solution that allows us to preserve the data in the very best of formats. So that's just kind of a first point that I wanted to throw out and see what our group of instructors and experts have to say. Abdallah, Luis, Lindsay, Kate, any comments, any thoughts? Everybody awake? Remember, everybody in Africa and Europe, this is first thing in the morning. And also remember, Kate is a herpetologist at heart, so she's just about to crawl out from under a rock into the sun.
Just to mention my experience in my PhD thesis, what I use is that I collect all the information from all books in Chile related to epidemiology of rabies, and they have data from 1920. I mean, they have a lot of data there, but something that was very interesting to me is that even when that institution has powerful tools to molecular analysis, for example, they still have data that is not digital. So to collect data about the location of diseases outbreaks, there is a lot of work to do, at least in public health work.
So I'm thinking about the gradient of spatial size or population density across the entire, you know, from east to west, with population density being higher in the east and getting lower in the west. And I think that point data would be ideal in every situation, because you would just be able to have a more precise model. Sometimes that you may end up with a massive amount of data until you'll have to kind of figure out different ways to deal with these large data sets. But if you are in a situation where the data, where you have these polygons or these are real units, then there are some methods available, statistical models that you can use to kind of account for this gradient across the landscape and for population density. And so some of these models are called continuous autoregressive models. They're a spatial model. It's essentially a regression model that looks at the neighboring polygons to take into account different spatial factors that may be contributing to what you have going on in your specific area. So I agree with Town. I think the paper makes a nice point that when you look inside of these aggregated units, you can really see this variation across those aggregated units. But if you are in a situation where that point data just isn't available, there are some other models out there that you can use. But ideally, the point data would be most exciting, I think, to work with.
Well, put it this way. If you have the point data, you can use both sets of tools. Mm-hmm. If you have only the polygon data, you can only use those approaches that are able to deal with a footprint that is not point-based. Abdallah, just out of curiosity, for leishmaniasis or something like that in Egypt, how are disease data preserved and recorded?
Actually, I don't encounter the same problem in my mycetoma project. However, it's like I may have this problem in blue tongue disease, which I'm going to model. I'm going actually to extract the data, which most of them are polygon. However, it's like there is a paper published by Brady et al. For dengue in PLOS ONE, which assign a census, and there is a way to assign a score for each polygon, which is selected based on public health data, and afterward they are going to return and the data again to the administrative office, which sends the data for us to check if they are accurate or not. And so we will be, with one way or another, more close to the points which assign an accuracy for the georeferencing. I think that we will try as possible to be or to be focused on the point, not the polygon. Okay, because it's going to give a lot of difference, especially if we are going to model, for example, Egypt. It's not a way to model in Nile Delta and desert. Okay, so it's completely different environmental variables. So when you model polygon, I'm not going to say that you are going to get a correct model. You will get a biased model. This is the case actually in Egypt. Like the project of leishmaniasis, which the results that we got, it's actually if you have disease positive in Eastern Sinai or in eastern part of Egypt, you are going to have the disease positive in Western Sinai because both are desert and they are environmentally similar. However, this habit is not going to occur for mosquito, which is only focused or only concentrated in the Nile River area.
Okay. Other comments about formats of reporting disease data? Going once, going twice. Wanted to make some other comments about openness of data. I want to give you just a really quick introduction to biodiversity data. I've been working in this field for going on 30 years now, and until 15, 20 years ago, essentially biodiversity data were only accessed by hand, which is to say we would all go to natural history museums around the world, work with the specimens, jot down data, and that was data access. And it was slow, and it was hard work. And beginning, well, the collection that I curate here at the University of Kansas began in 1981. But let's say beginning 30 years ago, natural history museums began to capture the data associated with their specimens digitally. And obviously, the technologies associated with managing digital data have gotten better and better over the past 30 years. And so then you have kind of quick access inside the institution, but not necessarily outside the institution. And so in the late 1990s, a group got together. University of Kansas was involved, University of California at Berkeley, and several other institutions. And essentially what was developed was a common vocabulary for describing a biodiversity record. So this is called the Darwin Core. You can look that up on Google, all one word, Darwin Core. And it's a very well documented standard now. Well, what Darwin Core allowed people to do was to post versions of biodiversity data sets in formats that could easily be integrated with other biodiversity data sets. And so now, 15, 20 years later, we have massive amounts of biodiversity data available online. So I'll show you several of these facilities. Here is just as a first example, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And so this is known as GBIF. And what you can see right away is 500 million biodiversity data records online. Now, Luis showed you a little bit of the characteristics of these data. 500 million is not necessarily spread evenly across all of life. And in fact, of those 500 million, a very, very substantial portion are birds. And birds are not always the most disease relevant of vertebrates. And obviously we would greatly prefer to have nice, even representation of all mammals and insects and maybe even pathogens. But at the very least, this is a pretty spectacular data set. So this shows you the spatial distribution of those records. And various amongst this group have used those records for various studies. For example, Kate is working for her dissertation on these data that you see between Australia and Antarctica, which are records of seabirds. And Luis, for his dissertation, was working with records of mammals from across Chile and southern South America, and so forth and so on. So GBIF is one very large source. It has some very big advantages and it has some very big disadvantages. The disadvantages are mainly in the realm of georeferencing, managing uncertainty, and managing ancillary data that enrich records. And I think GBIF has gotten so into quantity that they have at times not put as much or not put enough attention to quality. So here's kind of a very different example. This is VertNet, and this comes out of 4 major vertebrate networks: birds, fish, herps, and mammals. And VertNet is very simply the amalgam of those 4 networks, and it's mostly museum data, and it's mostly from North America. But VertNet has done a very elegant job of managing those data about uncertainty. So just to show you an example, here is a mouse that is the host of the most commonly transmitted hantavirus in North America. And VertNet can very quickly access a huge amount of data about this. It takes it a little while to appreciate how much data, but it's literally more than 100,000 records for this one mouse. The data can be accessed in tabular format, the data can be downloaded, and one can access maps, and one can essentially access more and more and more of the data set simply by asking. So the beautiful thing about VertNet is full management of uncertainty data and a massive effort oriented at georeferencing these data sets. I'll give you one more example. Species Link is a Brazilian effort, and Species Link has taken kind of very different paths towards many of the same goals. We can access all of these collections, coming up in a second. Yep. Oh, sorry, it's on the, there we go. So all of those collections across Brazil are sharing data as part of the Species Link network. You can see over to the right, it's almost 7 million records online, of which more than 5 million are georeferenced. And Species Link has done quite an excellent effort aimed at data quality and essentially rating and qualifying data according to their consistency. And so this is another very useful set of tools. There are many more that we could mention. The South African Biodiversity Information Facility, the Atlas of Living Australia, etc., etc. Lots and lots of very interesting data resources, and almost all of them are centered around this one single innovation of the Darwin Core, a common vocabulary for describing a biodiversity information record. Now, if any of you have tried to find data relevant to diseases, you know that that same facility doesn't exist for disease data. Perhaps the biggest and best exception might be some of the data sharing efforts for influenza, and there are some very interesting kind of mapping and data visualization efforts aimed at soil helminths and things like that. There's a site called This Wormy World. But by and large, disease data are not available. And I would throw out, and see what my companions have to say about this, but I would throw out that one big impediment to progress in this world of anticipating and understanding disease distributions is simply that the data are so sequestered. A few people might have access to a lot of data, and most people have access to very few data. What would be the steps? Number one is that shared vocabulary. How do you describe a disease occurrence record? And it's not simple. And a second big step is perhaps almost certainly the most difficult, and that is to change the culture. To change the culture to one of data are a common good and should be out there for everybody to use, explore, and analyze. Obviously, you have to take care of privacy considerations, and so the data that are easily online might not be so precise, but there should then be a path of access to the full data, providing that one provides appropriate documentation of how one will manage the data to avoid compromising privacy considerations. Any thoughts from the other instructors?
I just want to say that I was looking for information about vectors, and there are several nice web pages about vectors, but you cannot collect the data from them. You can see the data, the points in the world, but you cannot collect the data. And new effort I would like to show you, I don't know if you can see this screen, but is this page of which name is HealthMap, and what they do is that they collect the posts around the world using keywords of diseases. So usually you are going to have some reports that are official reports of diseases, but sometimes you are going to have just, I don't know, something like, we are developing a course about influenza. So you are going to have the point of influenza, but in reality, that point represents only something different. It's not an outbreak, for example. And I found this manuscript describing the use of data to model diseases in maps, and I found that they use this source of HealthMap that I just showed you to develop a map of dengue. So I noticed that in the methods they did not describe the methodology to clean the data, and this data is full of noise. So if we are going to collect data in the available databases, we must to take care a lot of the noise involved there. Just that. And you was talking about the the theory that we must develop in the field. And today in the morning, I received one manuscript that using these warnings from Google, that is from the laboratory of James Wood, was published in Epidemics, and they are saying that the new challenges for modeling emerging diseases, one of the most important challenges are develop the theory behind this field. So I guess that compared with biodiversity modeling, disease modeling is some steps behind. Just that.
I was actually seriously remiss with respect to one data source. Take a look at VectorMap. I'm seriously remiss because I've been part of this project since pretty early in its development. But VectorMap is essentially a data portal to a quite large, mostly centralized data set about mosquito distributions. It's based at the Walter Reed Biosystematics Unit in the Smithsonian Institution. And it has data resources about mosquitoes, sandflies, and ticks. And so it has quite a lot of interesting data and very interactive interface, which is not interacting with me right now. But again, that's a major data resource, and in fact is essentially the only accessible global data set on vectors. Certainly not complete, but at least it has a global reach. Any other thoughts from the other instructors?
I like only to comment about VectorMap, which is ideal actually to extract the data for vector, simply because it's the data submitted by author or co-author, which is highly informative about what study area exactly he collected the species of interest. So the data is maybe or it's actually ideal, and to some degree its high accuracy is assigned to the data. For example, mosquito in Egypt, the data is actually submitted by the people who work there, and they assign the georeferences by themselves, and it's represent what's going in Egypt from the vector points or from mosquito, which is involved in the transmission cycle very well. Also, I like to give a comment for HealthMap, which is just completely against the idea of VectorMap, which is sensitive and submitted by author. HealthMap is just data which present occurrence of the specific disease in state or in country. So it's not sensitive enough to be used for environmental model or for ecological niche modeling. And I think it will be a good idea to see what countries suffer from the disease, but you are going to return back to the authorities and ask for the data from these countries. And also it used like some reference like Ministry of Health, which after you return back to the website of the Ministry of Health, you will find full information about the disease outbreak for each point available in HealthMap. I will completely agree with Town regarding the privacy of data. For our work, we are not going to attach ourselves for data privacy or sensitive data. We are not interested in name of patient. We are not interested in who he is or she is, and where he live. This only our questions. What are the exact location of the patient? We are not going to have data which is sensitive if he is male or female, if he is 25 or 50. We are not encountered in these points, so we are not going to be associated with any sensitive data. So if there is a help from the health authorities to share the data with people, or like CDC or other organizations which is interested in health and hygiene can have this data available on map, this will be actually a good idea for us to begin our work and for future mapping of many disease and rapid response which may be necessary for some disease system. This is all what I have in my comment.
So going back to HealthMap, what one could imagine is that when posts are made, or at least when certain types of posts are made, like when they're at the level of confirmed as opposed to, for example, request for information, one could imagine adding to that metadata in a very standardized format, which would be the point or the polygon to which the record is referred. So it's not hopeless, but at present, if you're going to use that sort of data, as I think Luis and Abdullah mentioned, finding effective ways of cleaning and quality controlling the data is pretty crucial. So those are some comments about constraints and limitations to future progress in this field. Any other thoughts from the five of us? And I've seen nothing from.
I think I need to add one more comment for people who use data from BROMED or other alerts program which used just to alarm with the presence of disease at a specific area. For example, BROMED. We must be careful working with such data because it's still you have like situation, but you don't have information if the disease is confirmed or not. So a lot of questions may be required to confirm if the cases is already identified and confirmed on the level of diagnosis or not, and the specific region exactly the disease reported. So I see most of papers now use ProMed to access the data without assigning any accuracy or for their georeferencing. With one way or another, this may challenge the work of mapping and may give a very bad pictures or very wrong map with just like data which I think it's not accurate from the points of accuracy or the points of diagnosis.
That's a very good point. And in fact, very generally, anytime, any data set, be it the biodiversity data, be it ProMed data, be it a data set that's given you by the world expert in a field, checking for consistency, cleaning the data, assessing the data is crucial. And if you're writing a paper, there ought to be a whole paragraph about what did you do to assure the quality and consistency of the data that you use. Okay, that's a first piece of this morning. And give us 5 minutes and we'll be back with a second piece which will be a little more optimistic and we'll be talking about essentially opportunities. So we'll see you all in 5 minutes.